This is the eighth video in a series on how to do a cybersecurity risk assessment and forms part of the first stage of the GRC lifecycle, assess risk. In the previous video, we worked out which controls we wanted to use for the risks that we identified. In this video, we will work out the risk ratings for those risks. We know that each risk has a likelihood or the chance of it occurring and an impact or how bad it would be if it did occur. We can combine this together to determine the risk rating by using a risk matrix like the one shown here to cross-reference the likelihood and the impact. In this simple risk matrix, for example, if the likelihood is high and the impact is high, then we consider the risk to be high. If the likelihood and impact are low, then we consider the risk to be low. If the likelihood is high and the impact low, or the likelihood low and the impact high, then we consider that to be medium risk. Each risk has an inherent risk rating, also called a gross risk rating, which is the worst case scenario. This assumes that we have no controls in place at all. We then have the target risk rating, which assumes that all the controls that we recommended are in place and working effectively to lower the risk to the point that we want it to be at. The current risk is the situation where we are right now, which is probably going to be that we have some controls in place, but they may not necessarily be fully effective. We don't actually know this, and that is not the purpose of this document. We determined what the current risk rating is in the controls validation audit, where we look in great detail at what controls are actually in place and whether they're working effectively or not. We can also think of inherent risk, target risk, and current risk as being like a journey with an origin, a destination, and a current location. We start off at the point of origin with no controls in place. We want to arrive at the destination with all controls in place. And currently we have some controls in place as we are partway through the journey. As mentioned, we don't really look at current risk when we're doing the security risk assessment, but I'm still mentioning this for completeness of understanding. We will know the current risk ratings once we've done the controls validation audit. To understand how to actually use the risk matrix to come up with the risk ratings, we need to look at Appendix A in the risk assessment document. If we scroll down, we can see that we have these risk analysis scales. We have a likelihood scale and we have an impact scale. The idea here is you consider how frequently you think a risk would occur, or maybe you have hard information, hard facts on how often things occur. This can allow you to have a more educated determination of what the likelihood is. Equally, we can look down at the impact scale. We can consider this in terms of its operational impact, its financial impact, reputational impact, or legal or compliance impact. And if we can quantify the actual outcome of the risk, the detrimental effects of a risk occurring, we can then use this scale to determine how we should rate the impact of the risk using either an educated determination or actual information if we've seen this risk happen before and we actually have historical data for what happened. Once we know the likelihood and impact for each risk, we can then look at this example full-size risk matrix where we've got 5 different types of likelihood, 5 different types of impact, and we can simply cross-reference them to determine what the risk rating will be. As we go through for each risk and determine the risk ratings, I will have the likelihood scale and the impact scale in front of me on my other screen. I won't be able to show this to you. Instead, you will just see each risk one at a time, but I will be referencing these tables as I discuss why the likelihood and impact for each risk is what it is. Starting out with risk 1, unauthorized access to cargo trade logistics files and systems. I would put it right up in the corner here, where the likelihood is almost certain, level 5, and the impact is critical, also level 5. This is because if we think about what the risk actually is, unauthorized access to files and systems, if we didn't have any control whatsoever over people's ability to access things, then you could have just about any bad outcome imaginable. If we think about the likelihood and impact tables down in the appendix, we've got nothing in place to stop people from accessing things that they shouldn't, whether that's accidental, or whether it's a curious employee, if we look at our threat sources, or if we had a compromised account and then that malicious actor used that account to just access everything because they can, it's almost guaranteed this is going to happen. Looking at the likelihood scale, we can say that almost certain being that it happens every 6 months or shorter than that is what would happen. If we then think about the impact, if there was no control over what people can access and people can then access things that they shouldn't be able to, we could have the digital logistics platform brought down through having information corrupted or deleted, and it would cause catastrophic issues for the everyday business processes of cargo trail logistics. So, in terms of the impact, we consider this to be critical, maximum impact, because you're able to do maximum damage to the company. In addition, if sensitive information like commercial information, HR information of employees, if this was able to be accessed by anyone who, regardless of whether they should or not, you'd then have legal and compliance problems as well. You'd have fines and financial penalties. If unauthorized access could just happen, you would have huge problems. So we consider this to be as bad as it can get. Remembering that the inherent or gross risk rating is based on there being no controls in place. So we assume the worst case scenario. If we then talk about the target risk rating, we then need to consider the different controls that we recommended putting in. In this case, I would say the likelihood is unlikely and the impact is moderate. So therefore, we have a medium risk rating. I believe the likelihood is unlikely because these control measures, like access control, for example, mean that people are only given access to the things that they should. So it's possible that things slip through the gap, that we've accidentally given people access, or access is not quite removed in time, but it's still possible that this happens. If we have logging and auditing, we are hopefully going to catch cases of unauthorized access and then close that vulnerability that caused it so it doesn't happen again. If we have configuration management, hopefully we are reducing the likelihood that we have something accidentally allowed to be publicly accessible instead of requiring someone to log in first. But fundamentally, we cannot remove the risk entirely. It's unlikely that we have unauthorized access, but it's still very much possible because there could be mistakes. The controls will not catch everything. Then for impact, I believe it's moderate because even if we reduce the likelihood, it's still not zero. So it can still occur. And when it does, have we really changed how bad it's going to be? If we think about information being disclosed, since we have provided some protection, reasonable protective steps to protect confidential information, if we do have compliance problems, we will not have as big of a problem, but there is still an issue. We will still have media coverage, for example. We may still have fines and compliance problems. But if we can prove that we've done something, we're at least not completely negligent as a custodian of sensitive and personal information. Business impact point of view as well. Though we can reduce the impact through some of these controls, we have alternative systems in place. For example, it's never going to be the same as if we had the proper, most efficient system that we would ideally be using. We also might, for example, have encrypted data, which reduces the impact because it's not going to be as bad if the data is encrypted as opposed to not encrypted, but it's still possible that that data is decrypted once it is in the wrong hands. This risk demonstrates how you will often have a high risk, the very high risk in this case, that ends up being more down towards a medium once the controls are in place. It could be possible based on the circumstances that a very high risk only ends up coming down to a high risk once the controls are there. It's highly unlikely that you start at very high and you end up down at low, because the things that make it very high in the first place, maybe you have a lot of very sensitive information, maybe it's a really critical process, it's highly unlikely that you are able to make that so unlikely it's going to happen and make it, especially the impact, make it so low impact. Because if it's going to be very high to begin with, it's simply not really going to be possible to realistically reduce it from the maximum level of risk down to the minimum level. It all depends on the context, of course. It depends on the client, depends on the risk, on so many things. But generally, you'll see something like we've seen here. If we start at very high, we can get it down to about medium, but it's very unlikely that you'll be able to get it much further if it begins at very high. For risk two, misuse of access to cargo trail logistics files and systems, I would have the same likelihood rating of almost certain and the same impact rating of critical. So we also end up with a very high level of risk. This is because fundamentally we're talking about the same sort of problem as in risk one. Here, this is highlighting that you have two different types of access control problems. You have unauthorized access, where access was never meant to be there in the first place. And then you have misuse of access, where the access was meant to be available to this user, and they have simply done the wrong thing with that access. But fundamentally, if someone chooses to disclose confidential information, if someone chooses to overwrite or delete information or cause a system outage, we also have very critical impact. If the digital logistics platform cannot function, then cargo trail logistics business processes have major problems. And if we had a malicious actor who worked at the company and had access to anything and everything, it's highly likely, almost certain, that they would explore what they can access and then do something malicious once they had realized that they had the right sort of information within their grasp. For the target risk rating, we're also looking at unlikely, likelihood, moderate impact, and therefore a risk rating of medium. And this is because we're talking about, again, not only the same sort of risk basis, but also the same controls. If you have someone who wants to misuse their access, it's still very possible that they can do this. We would ideally only hire the right people for the job if we've done things like personnel vetting. We would give them only access to the things that they need to do their job. So, of course, it's still possible, but if you only had one or two people at a company who can access sensitive finance information, only one or two people who can access HR information, and then you have dozens of other employees who do other things, but they cannot access that type of information, then you're looking at one of those finance or HR people having to be a bad actor who's managed to get through your screening process, and now they can try to do bad things. So it's very much still possible, but we've made it unlikely that we have someone who manages to be in a position to have access to sensitive data, only really needing access for their job role, and they want to do something bad with it. And with the impact is the same for the previous risk, we are trying to not retain too much information. So if we do have some kind of disclosure, we were not keeping customer records for decades in the systems. We were only keeping what we needed. It's encrypted, so this makes it more difficult for people to access it if they do get their hands on the information, if it is disclosed, but it's not impossible to decrypt it. And the business process alternatives that we have in place for in terms of a continuity plan are not going to be perfect. The company can still do things, but it's not going to be as good as you would normally be doing them. Or risk three, ransomware deployment. In this case, I'm going to say the likelihood is likely level 4. This is because some people are going to be naturally suspicious of phishing emails or attempts through SMS to trick people, other social engineering, downloading suspicious files. It's not going to be as likely as if you just had no access control, anyone can access anything. People will, at the very least, be curious. If they have bad intentions, they'll definitely exploit it. So I'm saying in this case, it's not almost certain. It's still likely, because we would presume most people wouldn't really know much about ransomware. They could be tricked into downloading it. But I'm willing to downgrade the likelihood a little bit to level 4. And the impact is still critical, though, because if you had an account that was compromised and then used to deliver ransomware into the AWS environment where the DLP is running, then you could shut down the company's systems. This would definitely be critical. if we think about it from an operational point of view. Then, if we had the recommended controls in place, I would say it is unlikely, likelihood, moderate impact. Therefore, we're looking at a medium risk. Likelihood is unlikely due to access control preventing a compromised account, any given compromised account, from just doing whatever it wants. That account may not have access to systems that really mean the ransomware can disrupt very much. We would also have antivirus or anti malware in place to ideally detect that there is some malicious software and do something about it before it can actually do what it wants to do. If we then had our own encryption on sensitive data, if confidential and sensitive information is exfiltrated as part of the ransomware deployment, then at least we have some added protection because we have encrypted the data first. So that reduces the impact of it. Also, as mentioned previously, for the access control, if ransomware is deployed, it hopefully only affects that person's laptop, for example, and it's reducing the impact on the company. Also, by having antivirus software in place, it can not only make it less likely that the ransomware is able to execute in the first place, but it can also stop it spreading to other devices, servers, and systems. For risk 4, an employee device is compromised. Similar to the ransomware, we could say that the likelihood is likely. It's not almost certain because some people are naturally suspicious of email. They might go to a fake website that someone's tricked them into accessing because they were using a public Wi-Fi network, and they might be able to tell. So there will be some natural skepticism from people, but a lot of people are probably going to fall for phishing emails. So it's therefore going to be likely. The impact is then going to be significant since we're only talking about the employee's laptop itself. That laptop could have sensitive information stored on it on the device instead of being in the cloud, for example. And so that information is therefore potentially going to be disclosed. If we think about that employee not being able to work properly if their device is compromised, maybe they had some very important work on it and now that gets deleted, maybe it gets modified, or the device is just inaccessible. So if they were a critical employee at the company, they may, through their inability to work properly, impact the business operations of the whole company. If they were a critical decision maker and they needed information on their laptop and or their laptop itself to work, then we could have significant operational impact. For the target risk rating, we're looking like the previous risks at unlikely, likelihood, moderate impact, therefore medium risk. The likelihood is unlikely because having antivirus on all the laptops, ensuring that it's there, ensuring that you control the configuration of the laptops through some kind of device management solution, ensuring that you have security awareness training so people are aware of the threats that bad actors will try to use to compromise their account, like phishing, means that it's still possible this would happen, that someone would have their device compromised, but you're making it a lot less likely. Therefore, we can say it's unlikely. And then we can reduce the impact to moderate since we would make sure that devices have, for example, encryption on the hard drive. So any information stored on the computer itself is encrypted, making it more difficult for anyone to usefully access the information. We may also ensure that employees do work either from the cloud or they work off of their device and the device is copying important files to the cloud. So if something does happen to their device, then there are backup copies stored on a cloud server, such that if something does happen to their device, then you don't lose your only copy of some critical document. Leads us then to risk 5, loss of critical business data. For this risk, the likelihood is likely, impact is significant, therefore we have a risk rating of high. Saying the likelihood is likely because some people, just like the ransomware and the device being compromised, some people are naturally skeptical. Some people will keep backups of things even though they don't have to. It's just what they do. You might also have information shared between different people in the company. So if one person's copy becomes corrupted or deleted, modified, it's likely that you do unofficially, inadvertently have backup copies spread around the place somehow. So it's possible that you have this, but it's also possible that you have something that is very critical and there might just be one copy. So therefore, we're saying that it's likely. And the impact is significant because there could be a significant impact on business operations if critical information was lost somehow. But it's not like the entire company is going to shut down because one piece of information is not available. It may cause a lot of operational disruption, but it's not going to be absolutely critical from an operational point of view. Another thing that makes the impact significant rather than critical for the first couple of risks that we did is the fact that we are talking about more of a one-dimensional situation here, where it's just information being lost. It's an attack on integrity. For some of these other risks, we're looking at a multi-dimensional attack where you could have information deleted. You could also have that information disclosed prior to it being deleted. And you could also have systems that are shut down. And so when you accumulate these things together, you'd be looking at, say, a compliance breach, financial impact, operational impact. When you add them together, then you can go to another level of impact on the business. For the target risk rating, I would again look at unlikely, likelihood, moderate impact, and medium rating overall. This is due to access control preventing just anyone from having access to that critical data in the first place to be able to delete it or modify it. So it's not as likely that it's going to happen. And then when it does happen, if we have proper backups in place, we will almost always have some disruption because you're not going to have data backed up every second. So it might be backed up, even if it's every 24 hours, you will have still lost some information. So this will still give you a decent impact. And if the backups are even less frequent, like every week, every month, the amount of information you've then lost when you have to restore from a backup could be quite a bit. For risk 6, inadequate incident response and recovery processes. I'm willing to believe that some people are naturally going to be skeptical of phishing emails, for example. They might inadvertently have backup copies of things, but if people have not had any experience or training or guidance whatsoever in how to respond to incidents, I doubt that many people at all are going to react in the right way. So if you hadn't done anything to put incident response and recovery processes in place, I doubt that anyone would simply know what to do. Some people might, but I am willing to believe it's a small minority. People wouldn't know what to do. They might just turn their computer off. They might, unplug it from the wall. They might turn the Wi-Fi router off. Or they just do nothing. They have no idea what to do. So I can see the stress and panic being significant, such that if you had nothing in place to guide people and you just rely on them to do what they do naturally, they would just not do the right thing. So I can see this being very likely if there's absolutely nothing in place, which we assume when we're doing inherent and gross risk. With the impact being significant, since we're essentially talking about this being another layer on top of an existing incident, I wouldn't quite make it critical level 5 impact, but significant because you're simply making something else worse by not having any idea what to do, not having any processes, any systems, any training in place to know what to do when, firstly, you don't even know if something is going wrong. It relies on people recognizing that there's something wrong, and then you've got to know what to do, if anything. So I don't quite see this as being critical by itself, but I see this as being significant because it can add impact on top of the incident that's already there and make it worse. For the target risk rating, the likelihood is unlikely, the impact is moderate, and therefore we have a medium risk rating. This is because we can have training, we can have guidance, we can have practice, we can have testing. So people have an idea of what to do. They're going to behave much better than they would without any of those things. But you cannot ever have a perfect response to something. It's still possible, but unlikely that we don't really respond to a situation properly because we don't remember what to do. We're still a bit stressed. We're still a bit panicking when these things are happening. And when we're executing processes, even though we might have planned and we might have tested and practiced, we're still going to have things that go wrong. Our response is not going to be perfect. So we are then adding a layer of impact on top of the best case scenario for the incident by itself. The response process is never going to go perfectly, and you may have people applying the wrong plan or response to something due to a misdiagnosis. We're making the response process better. It's much better than having absolutely nothing at all, but things can still go wrong in the response process. Or risk 7, the AWS tenancy being compromised. I'm saying the likelihood is possible. The impact is critical. Therefore, we are looking at a high risk rating. The likelihood is possible because we do have guidance when we're setting up things like a cloud environment to put in place security features to make sure that we configure it correctly. There is nudging towards this by the provider. They don't want us to set up things insecurely. Remembering, of course, that the cloud provider protects the cloud infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, but we have to configure the environment in a digital sense to provide the cybersecurity component. If the data center provider is giving us the physical security, we have the cybersecurity component and the information security component on our side that we have to do. So there is some assistance to guide you in the right direction from the cloud service provider. But if the tenancy was compromised, then you are bringing down the digital logistics platform, which would be catastrophic for the business processes of the company. You'd also have a lot of information processed through that platform. And if that was disclosed, that would also be pretty catastrophic. So, similar to the access control risks in the beginning, you're looking at a whole host of different impacts: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And therefore, these pile up to have a critical impact. Well, the target risk rating, we'll look at unlikely, likelihood, moderate impact, and medium risk. This is due to the fact that if we have things like configuration management, we can set it up correctly in the first place. We can then control who can change things. We don't want to have someone inadvertently or deliberately change something so it's now publicly accessible when it shouldn't be. It's less likely that we have these issues, so therefore it's unlikely, but it's still possible. Could also reduce the likelihood by doing penetration testing on our environment to try to find any issues ahead of time and make sure that they're not still there to be exploited by malicious actors later. We also might use security features within the cloud environment already above and beyond what is suggested to us by default when we first set up the environment. We can then reduce the impact by having things like encryption in place, by having data retention in place, so we don't have as much data compromised and it's not as useful to people if it's encrypted. By making sure we have logging as well, we can potentially catch issues earlier on before they become a bigger problem. Despite these controls that we may put into place, reducing the likelihood that bad things happen, it's difficult to fundamentally change the fact that it's still the tenancy being compromised. And the impact of that is simply not going to go down too much, since you're talking about affecting this fundamental system at the heart of cargo trail logistics business operations. For risk 8, the exploitation of a vulnerability in the digital logistics platform, we're looking at the same ratings as the AWS tenancy being compromised: possible likelihood, critical impact, and therefore high risk. We're saying it's possible that this happens because we don't necessarily have a guarantee of vulnerabilities in the software, yet we also cannot guarantee that they're not there. So we're taking a middle ground approach. There may or may not be vulnerabilities that can be exploited. The impact is then critical because these vulnerabilities could allow the digital logistics platform to be taken offline completely and heavily disrupt the business processes of cargo trail logistics. We could also have the disclosure of sensitive and confidential information and potential compliance breaches and the reputational damage along with that. So we're saying the risk is high. For target risk rating, we're then looking at unlikely, likelihood, moderate impact, therefore medium risk. We can put into place measures to make sure we have a lower likelihood of there being errors in the software, but we cannot rule it out completely. It's also not just about creating the software in the first place. We will then have to update the software over time. And as we make these changes, there may be vulnerabilities introduced. Ultimately, the controls we put into place are reducing the likelihood, but we can never eliminate it completely. In terms of the impact, similar to the AWS tenancy being compromised, we can reduce the impact a little bit by making sure that we encrypt any data involved in case confidential information is disclosed. But we're talking about, at the end of the day, the most central core system to cargo shore logistics business processes that if something were to happen to this, the impact is going to be pretty strong. Even if we have some backup plans in mind for how we might do these business processes, it's still going to be at the very minimum moderate impact if the digital logistics platform has problems. For risk 9, a service disruption for the digital logistics platform, similar to the vulnerability in the DLP, we're also looking at possible likelihood and critical impact. There's no guarantee that we have a service disruption, but equally, it's very possible that we do. So we're looking at a middle ground here. You occasionally have issues with cloud service providers having problems delivering cloud infrastructure availability to their customers, and therefore when those customers are servicing their customers, in this case through the DLP, that system will be down occasionally. Doesn't happen very often, but occasionally. There's no guarantee that it will be available all the time. Equally, it's possible that there is an error in the code. It's possible that there is a faulty update. It's possible that there is a DDoS attack. These things could happen. And if we don't really think they're strongly likely or unlikely, then we can look for the middle ground, which is that they're possible. In terms of impact, this is going to be critical, similar to a vulnerability in the DLP being exploited, because this is a very important system for CTO. And if this DLP goes down, then it's going to be quite difficult for them to operate as normal. Well, the target risk rating, we're then looking at a reduced likelihood down to unlikely, reduced impact down to moderate, therefore medium risk rating. We cannot affect the likelihood that we have an AWS outage. This is completely outside the control of CTL. The secure software development can reduce the likelihood that you have some kind of coding error or faulty update. So we have reduced the likelihood a little bit. We've reduced the impact a bit because if we have, for example, a denial of service attack, we can mitigate this by having denial of service attack prevention systems. But if we do have a service disruption, it's still similar to the AWS tenancy being compromised and a DLP vulnerability being exploited. If we have any real issue with this core fundamental system, we cannot really reduce the impact below a certain level, which I'm saying is moderate because of just how important it is. For risk 10, the DLP API connectivity not available. In this case, I would say the likelihood is possible, the impact is moderate, therefore we begin with a medium risk rating. And this is because fundamentally, if you think about what we're talking about, the DLP still functions itself. It's just that we have issues with some of these systems that connect to it to enable it to function correctly. It's possible that we have a code error which stops API connectivity from working as intended. We could have a denial of service attack where a certain type of API is used to send a lot of traffic to the DLP, so it just cannot handle it and the system doesn't work properly. Or we could just have a lot of legitimate traffic through a certain API and the system can't function properly. So we can pick a moderate level of likelihood possible. This is definitely possible. But the impact I'm starting out as moderate because it's not the DLP itself, like some of the previous risks where the entire DLP is down and therefore things cannot really function at all. In this case, the DLP relies on other systems to do certain things to help out in certain areas, but the DLP itself is fundamentally still working. It's just that you might need to deal with issues in certain specific areas, such as specifically if the shipments cannot be tracked because that API has a problem. If customs clearance specifically, if that API has a problem, so we cannot connect to the customs clearance system or they cannot connect to us, in that one particular area, you have a problem. It's not the entire system coming down, so no one can do anything. So I see it being more manageable if there are problems. Therefore, the impact in this case is moderate rather than critical. For the target risk rating, then, we can go from possible down to unlikely for likelihood and from moderate to minor for impact. So therefore, we have a low risk rating. We can lower the likelihood because we're using secure software development to ideally not have errors on our side where we cannot connect to other systems properly, or they try to connect to us and we have a problem on our side because we didn't code it properly, because we updated the software and there was an error in the update. And then we have a lower impact because we can have systems in place to fight back against denial of service attacks. And we might have alternative ways of doing things. We might, from the continuity and recovery control, we might have a different way of doing customs clearance. Maybe we simply email the customs people the documents instead of having to use an API to have the DLP and the customs clearance software communicate automatically with no human involvement. So for this risk, because we're starting out at medium, we can now begin to get ourselves down into low, because it's not unreasonable to reduce the risk from yellow to green, whereas to jump all the way from a red, very high risk down to low is a bit more difficult to justify, since the risk would only be up in the very high area because it was very serious in the first place. It's highly unlikely that controls can make such a huge difference to get it way down to here. Then we have risk 11, legacy warehouse software being compromised. I'm saying that the likelihood is likely, the impact is moderate, and therefore we're looking at a high risk. I'm saying it's likely because not everyone would be aware that legacy software is being used, that this particular version of a particular software is being used. But once this information is known, it is actually quite easy to look up vulnerabilities that are public knowledge. For impact, I'm saying that it's moderate because we're not talking about, say, the whole DLP going down and the whole company has a problem. In this particular case, we're probably talking about a particular logistics hub that has a problem. And for that particular logistics hub, it could be a very, very big problem because nothing can work there. Nothing can function. They don't know what their inventory is. They cannot send and receive shipments. But the overall company is not necessarily affected as much. You could reroute shipments to other warehouses. It's a bit more of a contained impact. And then saying that we're looking at a possible likelihood, a minor impact, and medium risk. Now, obviously, the best way to deal with this risk would ideally be to replace the legacy software completely. But assuming that that's not an option, the next best thing is to reduce the likelihood by trying to do, for example, some penetration testing and at least understanding what the vulnerabilities are so that we know what we're dealing with, trying to turn things off that we don't need, trying to reduce the ability for people to attack, having other systems as well that are scanning the server that the legacy software is on to potentially identify strange activities. We could use logging and auditing to try to pick up these activities and understand what is going on before it happens. We could have antivirus scanning to look for malware on the server. So we can reduce the likelihood a bit, but it's still going to have these vulnerabilities. So we cannot really reduce the likelihood that much. In terms of impact, we can reduce it further by having some kind of plan in place. If the warehouse system in this particular warehouse has a problem, how does that warehouse continue to function? How does CTL continue to function with this warehouse offline or with a more manual process? So we can reduce the impact down a bit from moderate to minor. For risk 12, the shipment routing engine being unavailable, I'm saying it's a possible likelihood. We simply don't really know or have any control over what the supplier does, what their security practices are, and so we simply cannot say whether it's going to be unavailable or not. It's out of the control of CTL. So I'm picking a middle ground and saying that it's possible. For impact, I'm then saying that it's minor because it's not only one specific system similar to the legacy software going down, it affects that particular warehouse, which will affect CTL overall, but it's not like the entire DLP went down. In this case, we're looking at one particular specialized service that the DLP utilizes to function normally. So it is already very contained and compartmentalized. And when we think about what it's actually doing, it's providing more efficient routing for shipments to be delivered faster and more cost effectively. If that wasn't working, it's not to say we cannot deliver anything at all. We may be looking at a bit of a delay, for example, but it's not going to be enormous because we can just navigate without this system. It's just that it's not optimally efficient as it normally would be. And then saying that for the target risk rating, the likelihood would be unlikely. So we've reduced that and the impact is minimal. We've reduced the impact because we've ideally done some assessments on the supplier and we understand what their security posture is, what systems they have, what kind of backup processes they have in place. Have they had any audits done? So we have a better picture, and ideally we choose a supplier who is a bit more resilient, who has a lower chance of something happening, of the likelihood of this happening. And then for the impact, we're reducing it to minimal because we would ideally have some kind of backup business process in place. So it's very clear to everyone, if the shipment routing engine goes down, it's not available, then here is what you do. We have some alternative process in place so that we then have a minimal impact. Similar to when we were selecting controls, for the next few risks, we can use the same logic to apply the same inherent and target risk ratings from risk 12 to the next few risks. Since we're talking about a very specific supplier system that normally assists the DLP in a particular way, if that has a problem, then we really don't know what the likelihood is since we don't know anything about the supplier. So we assume we have a middle ground possible likelihood. We also assume that we do not have that big of an impact because it is one particular system and the controls are going to be the same, that we have continuity and recovery to reduce the impact. If the supplier has a problem, we have backup plans on what to do, and we reduce the likelihood with supply chain security. So we ideally choose a more resilient supplier to begin with. So with that in mind, we can apply these risk ratings from risk 12 to risk 13 as well, shipment routing engine compromised. And for risk 14, freight carrier system unavailable. Same for risk 15, freight carrier system compromised. And also for risk 16, shipment tracking unavailable. For risk 17, an invalid invoice being paid. We could say the likelihood is possible since people may have a certain level of natural skepticism towards invoices, double checking them against the other information in the system. Other people may not do this. So we don't really know. We assume somewhere in the middle, but it's possible that this happens. And the impact we're assuming is minor because we would have one invoice amongst potentially dozens that CTL might handle every week. So considering the overall size of the business, it's highly unlikely that one particular shipment has a huge monetary value since logistics companies make their money through volume. We can say then that we start out with an inherent risk rating of medium. And then saying that for the target risk rating, we can reduce the likelihood down to rare, as we can use things like access control to limit who has access to these invoices, making sure that the person who can approve invoices and the person making payment is not the same person, using separation of duties. If it were more of an inside job, we can use security awareness training to make it more likely that employees do not fall for these sort of scams and tricks. We can use personnel security to make sure that we have fewer people in that position who might be looking to do this sort of malicious thing. We can also use supply chain security to ensure we have a list of our approved suppliers to make anything involving suppliers a bit more of a robust process, since not everybody would have the list of approved suppliers who should be sending invoices to CTL. For the impact, I haven't changed that since we cannot really change the fact that if an invoice is paid when it shouldn't have been because it was fake or invalid, the only way to change that would be to reduce the value of the invoice so the financial impact isn't as bad. And we cannot control that. It's completely beyond the control of CTL. So we just want to make it It's unlikely as possible that this happens at all. And when it does, we just have to accept that it's the same impact. For risk 18, a fake freight carrier being used, we have a likelihood of possible where we don't really know either way whether some people will pick up there's a fake freight carrier because they might do some investigation. It might not seem familiar, so they're a bit more inquisitive and skeptical. Other people might just assume it's fine and go ahead with it. So we're just going for the middle ground here. We're assuming a minor impact similar to the invalid invoice being paid. It would be ideally a one-off incident that this happened. Any particular freight carrier being used for one particular shipment is not going to be a huge issue overall for CTL since logistics companies go by volume to make their money. So we're looking at an inherent risk rating of medium. Then, like the invalid invoice being paid, we're looking at a likelihood of rare, an impact of minor. The likelihood is being reduced because we're reducing who has the ability to make approvals for using particular freight carriers. We're using awareness training to make sure employees are more wary of scams like this. We're using personnel security to control who has the ability to make these decisions, who is in the role. We want to make sure it's someone who doesn't have a criminal history, for example, or some history of fraud. And we're using supply chain security to register our suppliers, have this approved list, and make sure that we're only using freight carriers who've gone through some kind of vetting process where someone has gone and investigated the company, ideally visited their offices, done some checks on them to make sure they're a real company. And only once we're happy with this are they put on the CTO approved suppliers list, then they can be used by employees. And similar to the invalid invoice, there's nothing we can do about the impact of this. If a fake freight carrier is used, the impact is what it is, just like the invoice. The impact will be affecting that one shipment, hopefully. Hopefully, if this does happen, it's discovered straight away that this is a fake freight carrier, and the same fake freight carrier name cannot be used multiple times for multiple shipments. So we're limiting the impact to one shipment, but there's nothing we can do to change it. We just have to make the likelihood as low as possible. For risk 19, the IT managed service provider account being compromised. Similar to other suppliers, I'm saying we simply don't really know what the situation is. They may have security in place, they may not, it may be decent, it may not be. So we're just going for the middle ground of possible for the likelihood. And I'm saying the impact is critical due to the potential reach of a compromised supplier account. And I'm saying the impact is critical because a compromised account could do a lot of damage to CTO. It could be used to compromise the device of an employee by turning off endpoint security and then phishing that employee, taking over their account and using that to disrupt the DLP, disclose information. There are lots of potential issues, and therefore we have a high risk rating. For the target risk rating, we're then looking at unlikely likelihood, moderate impact, and therefore medium risk rating. This is because we can use things like supply chain security to audit the supplier, to understand their security posture, and ideally choose a provider who is a bit more secure, takes their security more seriously, so it's less likely that they have a problem. But of course, we can't rule it out completely. And we have no control over their ongoing security or any changes that they make. We then have a whole host of controls that we can use that we've mentioned for other risks as well, that just provide broad spectrum reduction in the ability for people to get access to things, the ability to recover from situations, have backup systems in place. If data is released, it's encrypted, reducing the impact of that. But similar to when we're dealing with the DLP being such a core system, this provider has a lot of access by default, by necessity, into CTL's systems, into their devices. So we cannot lower the impact too much. So I'm keeping that at moderate. So we end up with a target risk rating of medium. For risk 20, inadequate privacy protection. For inherent risk, I'm saying we have a possible likelihood and we have a significant impact. Significant impact being based on the kind of compliance breach that we could have, the kind of fines that we could be looking at. likelihood being possible because we simply don't know. If we have nothing in place, we don't really know whether people will naturally do sensible, reasonable efforts to protect information or not. We're simply not aware in this case, so we're going for the middle ground of possible, which leaves us with an inherent risk rating of high. For the target risk rating, we can reduce the likelihood down to unlikely, reduce the impact down to minor. Therefore, we have a target risk rating of low. This is because we can understand what our obligations are to make it less likely that we have inadequate privacy protection in place. We can put in place those measures that we need to, but it may be that for one reason or another, we are judged as not having sufficient things in place and we still have a compliance breach if there is a disclosure of information. And ideally, because we are putting measures in place, we are seen as being reasonable. Even if we still had a breach, at least we were doing our best and trying, so we can reduce the impact down to a less serious fine or penalty. Through these different risks, in some cases, when I was coming up with the ratings, I would look at those likelihood and impact tables and really have a think about, okay, what would the fines be? What would the operational disruption be? This sort of thing. In other cases, I'm just thinking in abstract terms, how likely is it that this would happen? Not necessarily in specific timeframes like in the likelihood table. It's up to you how you want to do it. As long as you can explain why you think it was that likelihood and that impact, we can then work out from there what the risk rating is. So the risk rating itself is very straightforward. It's just how do you decide what likelihood, what impact? You can be very scientific about it if you want, or you can just go on what you are assuming, what you feel. As long as you have some sort of justification, even if it only makes sense to yourself, at least that's better than just guessing or not having any idea whatsoever. Now that we know the inherent and target risk ratings for each risk, we can come up to the risk summary section of the document and fill in the risk summary table. This table lets someone reading the report get an overview of the different sort of risk ratings, just looking at this simple table near the top of the document. Below the risk summary table, we then have the inherent risk matrix, where we can visually display each risk, including the likelihood and the impact. And we can do the same further below for the target risk ratings. Okay, we've now completed all of our risk ratings. In the next video, we'll look at how to pull out the key information in our report and communicate this concisely in the executive summary. Let me know in the comments if you think one of the risk ratings that I gave should have been higher or lower.